Rosebud. Rosebud. Citizen Kane, the iconic film co-written, produced, and directed by Orson Welles. It is a film mentioned on every list of great films, often at the top. Citizen Kane, bandied about in film school hallways, referenced in nearly every film text, and yet, maybe not seen by as many people as you would think.
Pictures up. We're rolling. Rolling. Speed. Rolling. Ready, slate.
Scene 7A, take 1, marker.
Action.
Now, Casablanca. Everyone's seen Casablanca. Or at least they say they have. But Kane, not so much. People watch Casablanca because they want to. They watch Citizen Kane because they have to. Released 1 year apart, Citizen Kane in 1941 and Casablanca the following year, these two films make up the yin and yang of the foundations of filmmaking. And I want to spend this lecture talking about not only how these two great films created this foundation, but also to show you how they influenced other filmmakers for more than 75 years. First, I'll provide some historical context, and then we'll break down the essential important elements of each movie, demonstrating how they've been influencing great filmmakers ever since. First, the context. In the late 30s and early 40s, Hollywood was making a wide variety of films. Some of the most popular were westerns like Stagecoach or fantasies like Wizard of Oz. Politics played a role in films too. You had Frank Capra making political comedies like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Charlie Chaplin satirizing both Hitler and Mussolini in The Great Dictator. And there was social commentary. John Steinbeck was popular. Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath were both adapted into films. And David O. Selznick, he won the Academy Award for Outstanding Production, which is now Best Picture, in 1940 for Gone with the Wind, a romance film set against the backdrop of the Civil War. And despite how different these films were from each other, there are some key similarities. Number one, all of these films are linear, meaning they each start at a specific time in the characters' lives and move forward in time. And these characters who march linearly through these movies, they were either good or they were bad. And the films, they were either funny or they were serious. Storytelling in that day and age was very cut and dried. The heroes were good and the villains were bad. And the heroes always won at the end. They got the girl, they escaped, they won, or at the very least, they regained their macho dignity by not giving a damn. And there was also a visual and auditory familiarity that the audience had with these films. For instance, most scenes were 3 or 4 minutes long. A scene would typically start with a wide shot, and then as the actors spoke, one at a time mind you, never on top of each other, the editor would cut to a shot of the person in medium shot. And the shots were nearly always straight on, shot at eye level. This had something to do with the fact that most Hollywood sets didn't have ceilings because that's where the lights hung, and they shone down on the set. So the camera couldn't tilt up because, well, you'd see the lighting grid. And music. Long musical scores underneath the important scenes to create emotion and ambiance. But when a scene ended, the audio and the image from that scene would also stop, with entirely new audio and new images beginning in the next scene. And that was Hollywood filmmaking at the time. But Casablanca and Citizen Kane began to change all of that in two very, very different ways. As I said before, I think of them as yin and yang, head and tails of the same paradigm shift. one being the art of storytelling and the other being the craft of filmmaking. Let's begin with the art of storytelling. Let's look broadly at what makes a good story. And when I say broadly, I mean side of the barn broad, because here it is. What makes a good story is if people like it. And you know if people like it if they come back to the story over and over and over again. Or in film, if they watch it over and over and over again. And if they quote it, imitate it, emulate it. I mean, you get what I'm saying. The first feature film I ever made was a movie called Snakes and Arrows. And it was terrible. But I thought it was great at the time. I wrote it, I directed it, and I was getting my MFA in film at Columbia University. So not only did I think that I knew everything about film and storytelling, but I wanted to include everything that I knew in the story I was going to tell. I had 26 speaking roles, 18 locations, and at least 8 different genres, hundreds of film references, and not only did I have half a dozen significant plot twists, but I had 3 complete plot reversals, 4 red herrings, 3 surprise endings, and oh yeah, did I mention that the movie had twin protagonists, a guy and a gal, each named Joe? Needless to say, it was a convoluted mess. But I thought it was great. I thought I was so smart to weave all of those characters and plots and ideas into a single 100-minute story. But when I screened the film on opening night, people literally walked out. Not everyone, but enough. One of them was my longtime friend and mentor, Paul Hammock. I saw him walking out. I was sitting in the back row of the theater, and I followed him out into the lobby. He was getting popcorn, or at least that's what he said he was doing when he saw me. And I don't remember exactly how the conversation went, but I do remember the key line. Paul said to me, "Eric, I don't go to movies to see how smart the director thinks he is, or how many film references he can make. Stop trying to impress the audience, Eric. Next time, just have fun telling a good story." I go to movies to have fun. And he was right. That is not what Snakes and Arrows did. But that's what Casablanca does. People don't hail it for its groundbreaking techniques or its revolutionary use of sound design or special effects. No. But Casablanca is a movie that people watch over and over again. And I think people are drawn to the story for 3 interrelated reasons: the characters, the theme, and the ending. Now, if you haven't seen the film yet, then I want to give you fair warning that I'm about to dive into spoiler territory, because I'm going to discuss the ending of the film. Now, you're safe if you haven't seen Citizen Kane, but I'm going to give away some key information about Casablanca. Just be warned. Still with me? Good. Now, where were we? Characters, theme, and ending. And structure too, but we'll get to that in a little later. The characters in Casablanca are unique. Or at least they were unique at the time. The main character, Rick, who was played by Humphrey Bogart, was a new kind of hero in Hollywood. He was a rebel, a heavy drinker, hiding in the shadows with a shady past and a penchant for taking advantage of a situation, like the house rake against life's gamblers. And the woman he loved, Ilsa, played by Ingrid Bergman, she was no different, a backstabbing spy in the midst of a dirty war. Saying one thing and doing another, but without much backstory in the script to explain the reasons for either of these characters' behavior. This made the characters intriguing, more complex than the typical Hollywood fare at the time, more interesting, more human, good and bad mixed together. Casablanca's characters were an anomaly back then, but they soon became much more common. Rebellious heroism, unexplained duplicity can be tracked in great movies ever since. Rebel Without a Cause in the 1950s, Clute in the 70s, La Femme Nikita in the 90s, and Girl with a Dragon Tattoo in the 2010s, just to name a few. Naturally, different character types lead to different types of stories, or at least different types of endings to these stories. If your story was about a good guy, then Hollywood would have him win at the end. If the story was about a bad guy, then he loses in the end. Typical Hollywood. But if your character is a mix, and the woman that he loves is enigmatic as well, it only makes sense that your ending might be contradictory too. Rick doesn't get the girl. He doesn't escape Casablanca. He doesn't win the war. And neither does Ilsa. I mean, true, she continues the fight, but she loses Rick, her true love. And honestly, who really cares that she continues her fight with the Czechoslovakian resistance against the Nazis? I mean, no disrespect to the Czechs, but that wasn't the driving point of Ilsa's story, and it certainly doesn't feel like a victory for her character, or for Rick's. Most Hollywood movies, back then, resolved their problems by the end of the film. But Rick and Ilsa's, they continue. That was new and fresh to American audiences. And future filmmakers embraced that idea. Think of Vertigo in the 50s, Planet of the Apes in the 60s, Apocalypse Now in the 70s, Blade Runner in the 80s, and Basic Instinct in the 90s. And more recently, think of the Academy Award-winning film Moonlight. A heroically ambiguous ending quite often makes the audience rethink the entire film. And in so doing, we consider new themes. If Rick and Ilsa had ended up together, then perhaps we would have left the theater with a classic sense of true love always finding a way, or love conquering all, despite war, despite time, and the circumstances, that we should trust that our love will find a way. But that's not the theme of Casablanca. Instead, the unexpected ending makes us consider ideas of individualism, sacrifice, and the nobility of the outsider, the stranger in a strange land. We begin to wonder where our own allegiances lie. Perhaps we even begin to question authority, circumstance, and the American dream. Heady stuff, I know, but also perhaps themes that stuck in the American craw in the 1940s of World War II. The Korean War of the 1950s, Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, and the more recent and long-lasting wars in the Middle East ever since the 1980s.